The other thing Aaron Cross said to me, which I hadn't heard him say before outright, was that he believes the FBI should have, that the sheriff should have given the investigation over to the FBI, which most of the other people, again, that don't even like the sheriff who I've talked to within the department haven't gone as far as to say that. They have pride in their department. They're like,
They
no,
should.
I think we could handle it. They were helping us, but Aaron is now saying, no, I think that they should have handed it over. And the reason he cited is because, and now we heard Kash Patel say this a couple days ago or last week, that they had hundreds of agents ready to go. Patel says had hundreds of agents ready to go, and Aaron's like, look, we don't have that kind of manpower. The sheriff should have
Nobody
recognized
does.
that they just had an army, and why not let them handle it?
That is a reason to turn it over to the FBI because he obviously cannot get out of his own way. And I don't know if you ever saw the videos of Nanos in like, I think it was 2016 or
Mm.
something, where he was going on and on about how much he hates the FBI. So this isn't something that we're just pulling out of thin air. If all right, you hate the FBI, so what? We have to, take care of our constituents, do everything we can for people when they're missing, especially vulnerable individuals that are members of the community. Let's just come together, leave our egos at the door, and get on with it. Because you never know what could have happened in those first 4 days. And to have hundreds of agents and analysts sitting in their hotel twiddling their thumbs instead of being with their family, instead of helping the investigation, instead of wasting American dollars, people are there to work, put them to work.
A retired FBI agent sat down with an investigative journalist and said something that should have made every headline in America. She said the clown costume was overkill. She said it was designed to frighten. She said there were things about this case that she could not make sense of. And she has spent decades making sense of the worst things human beings do to one another. And then she said this: hundreds of FBI agents were staged and ready to go. Analysts, technology, an entire federal infrastructure, prepared, waiting, and willing. And instead of putting them to work, they sat in a hotel, twiddling their thumbs, while an 84-year-old woman was missing, while blood dried on a front doorstep, while a ring camera hung empty from a wall where someone had physically ripped it loose. 100 days have passed since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona, and the conversation between journalist Brian Entin and retired FBI Special Agent Maureen O'Connell may be the most honest and damning account of what went wrong in this investigation that anyone has put on record. Tonight, we're going to walk through every word of it, because what these two uncovered is not just about one missing woman. It is about a system that failed her, a chain of decisions that cost critical time, and a question that still does not have a satisfying answer 100 days later. Does anyone actually know where Nancy Guthrie is? Welcome to Keith's Crime Files. If this is your first time here, please subscribe right now and hit that like button. This channel exists to tell stories that demand to be told, and this is absolutely one of them. Now let us get into it. To understand why that conversation between Brian Entin and Maureen O'Connell carries so much weight, you first have to understand who Nancy Guthrie was and what the scene at her home looked like on the day she disappeared. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the well-known co-host of NBC's Today Show. She lived in a residential home in Tucson, Arizona, under the jurisdiction of the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Her physical condition was serious. Severe back problems had reduced her world to the walls of her home, and on her very best days, the short walk down to her mailbox. Most days, even that was beyond what her body could manage. That physical reality is not a background detail. It is the lens through which everything that followed must be understood. Because when investigators arrived at Nancy's home and stood in front of what was waiting for them there, the idea that this woman had simply walked away should have been ruled out almost immediately. The front doors were open. Blood was on the doorstep. The Ring doorbell camera had been physically yanked from the wall. Not damaged by weather, not malfunctioning, but deliberately removed by someone who did not want to be seen, and a blood trail extended from that doorstep to the point where a vehicle would pull up directly in front of the home, not down the street, not toward the mailbox, to the curb, where a car stops, where a person gets loaded inside. Savannah Guthrie described the scene in her own words during a public interview. She said the doors were popped open. She said there was blood on the front doorstep. She said the Ring camera had been yanked off, and she said the family's response was immediate and unambiguous. Something is very wrong, but that clarity did not immediately translate into the investigation that followed. According to sources familiar with the case, detectives in the earliest hours were operating under the assumption that Nancy had walked away on her own. That assumption, applied to a woman who struggled to reach her own mailbox at a scene marked by blood and a deliberately disabled camera, shaped the initial response in ways that, by multiple accounts, slowed everything down. Sources close to the investigation told Brian Entin directly that this early theory cost the case critical time during the hours that are statistically the most important in any disappearance. There was a later attempt to clarify the confusion around this point. Sergeant Aaron Cross, the union president within the Pima County Sheriff's Office, told Brian Entin that what detectives had initially communicated was misunderstood. He said the family had not believed Nancy walked away physically on her own, but had instead considered the possibility that she may have called an ambulance herself due to a medical emergency and been transported somewhere under her own direction. That is a meaningful distinction. It means the family was never at peace with the situation. It means they were alarmed and pushing for answers from the very beginning. And it means that the gap between what the family understood and what investigators were acting on represented a miscommunication that burned through irreplaceable time. Then Maureen O'Connell and Brian Entin began talking about the costume. The presence of a costumed figure connected to the circumstances surrounding Nancy's disappearance is one of the most disturbing details in this entire case. The figure was described as dressed in a clown-style outfit with tactical elements. And when O'Connell analysed it, her language was careful and precise in the way that only someone with her level of experience can be. She called it overkill. She said there were too many aspects of the costume that did not belong, too many deliberate choices layered on top of each other. And her conclusion was direct. That costume was designed to frighten. Think about what that means for a moment. Whoever came to Nancy Guthrie's home that day did not show up impulsively. They thought about what they were going to wear. They made choices intended to cause fear. They disabled the camera. They left through a point that suggested a waiting vehicle. Every element of that scene reflects a level of planning and premeditation that stands in direct contrast to the disorganized response that followed on the investigative side. And that is precisely what O'Connell and Entin dug into. The disorganization, the failures, the decisions that, in hindsight, look almost impossible to justify. Sergeant Aaron Cross went further in his conversation with Brian Entin than almost anyone else connected to the Pima County Sheriff's Office had gone before. He said outright that Sheriff Chris Nanos should have handed the investigation over to the FBI, not supplemented it, not collaborated on it, handed it over entirely. His reasoning was not complicated. The Pima County Sheriff's Office did not have the manpower that the FBI was prepared to bring. And when the FBI director himself, Kash Patel, publicly confirmed that hundreds of agents had been staged and ready to deploy, Cross said the question answered itself. Why would you turn that away? O'Connell described what a full FBI deployment actually looks like from the inside. Trucks arrive, antennas go up, computers come online, cables are run across the ground, software is activated. A complete operational command post rises out of nothing in a matter of hours, and an investigation is immediately functional at a scale that no single county department can replicate. She compared it to watching a military unit build a landing strip in the middle of a jungle. It is discipline, it is fast, and it is exactly what this case needed in its earliest hours. Instead, by multiple accounts, the first week looked nothing like that. Sergeant Cross told Brian Entin that the disorganization during that first week was so significant that detectives were struggling to communicate effectively with each other, not just with outside agencies, but among themselves. O'Connell noted that the FBI uses a system called Incident Command, a structured, practiced protocol for exactly these situations, designed to prevent the kind of breakdown that appears to have occurred. Every agency that participates knows the system. Every agent knows their role. Information flows up through the command structure and back out to the relevant parties. There should have been no cluster. There should have been no chaos. The tools to prevent it were available and present. And yet one neighbor reportedly became so confused by the presence of FBI agents near the scene that she questioned whether they were real. The Pima County Sheriff's Office reportedly spent significant time and resources, including taking fingerprints and working through the night, to verify that the agents were actually federal investigators. They were. But that episode became a symbol of how fractured the coordination had become in those first critical days. Underlying all of it was a dynamic that O'Connell addressed without hesitation. Historical video footage documented Sheriff Nanos expressing strong and explicit contempt for the FBI as far back as 2016. That is not an inference. That is on record. And O'Connell's response was measured but clear. Personal feelings about another agency cannot be the reason vulnerable people go without the resources they need. Egos have to be left at the door. People are there to work. Put them to work. The border was 45 minutes away the entire time. Tucson sits close to the U.S.-Mexico border. 3 crossing points exist within reasonable proximity to the area where Nancy lived. And from the beginning, law enforcement publicly dismissed the possibility that Mexico was involved in her disappearance. Retired Arizona Department of Public Safety Lieutenant Dave Smith offered a theory in a public interview that drew significant attention. He suggested that downplaying the Mexico angle was the most effective way to prevent the case from becoming a federal matter, because if international transport was suspected, federal jurisdiction would follow almost automatically. Brian Entin traveled to the Nogales border crossing himself while covering this case. He walked in. No one stopped him. No questions were asked. Entry into Mexico from that crossing required almost no interaction with any official. He noted that, without a vehicle description and without a known suspect, identifying one specific car among the thousands that cross daily would require exactly the kind of federal camera access and cross. Border coordination that the FBI was positioned to provide. 100 days later, Sheriff Nanos was caught outside his office by a reporter and asked directly, "Are you any closer to solving this case?" His answer was 2 words. He said, "We are." Then he got into his car and left. But sources close to the investigation told Brian Entin something different, that there is no singular suspect, no closing lead, and no sense among those working the case that a resolution is near. Somewhere in the distance between those 2 answers, Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Her daughter marked day 100 with a message that carried the full weight of 100 days of silence. Savannah Guthrie wrote, "Mother, daughter, sister, Nun, we miss you with every breath. We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you. Someone knows something that can make the difference. Someone does, and this story is not finished." Stay with Keith's Crime Files. Subscribe if you have not already. Leave a like on this video. And stay close, because we are going to keep following this case until there are answers. Nancy Guthrie deserves that. Her family deserves that. And the truth, whatever it turns out to be, deserves to be told. O'Connell has been in rooms where local agencies did not want the FBI present. She has worked alongside people who resented federal involvement, who felt their authority was being encroached upon, who allowed institutional pride to shape decisions that should have been made purely on the basis of what the victim needed. And every single time her approach was identical. Build a bridge. Divide the work. Roll up your sleeves and get it done. Because the job is bigger than anyone's feelings about jurisdiction. And the person who is missing is depending on every person in that room to act accordingly. She described exactly how that negotiation works in practice. The FBI walks in and says, "We will handle this piece. You handle that one. We will run the phones. We will work the financial angles. We will process the digital evidence." And everything we find, every lead, every report, every piece of intelligence, comes directly back to your department in a clean, organized, fully documented form. The local agency loses nothing. They gain everything, and the investigation moves at a pace and scale that no county department can replicate on its own. That infrastructure was ready. Those agents were staged. Kash Patel, the FBI director, said so publicly. Hundreds of agents prepared to deploy, and the first week of the Nancy Guthrie investigation was still, by the account of people inside the Pima County Sheriff's Office itself, complete and total chaos. O'Connell did not let that word pass without examining it. Chaos at a crime scene of this magnitude, she said, is not an accident. It is a leadership problem. Trained professionals do not fracture on their own. When an entire investigative response collapses in its opening week, it is because something is broken above the people doing the work. She suggested that what deputies and detectives were likely absorbing from above was not a clear mission and a unified purpose, but anxiety about the Bureau, warnings about jurisdiction, signals that territory mattered more than momentum. And when you put that kind of noise into people's heads, instead of a focused directive, everything downstream suffered. Sergeant Aaron Cross confirmed as much to Brian Entin. He described the first week as so disorganized that detectives were struggling to communicate effectively among themselves, not just with outside agencies, but with each other. O'Connell's response was unambiguous. That is a leadership failure. It should not have happened. There was no operational reason for it. Every tool needed to prevent exactly that kind of breakdown was available, present, and ready to be used. Then the conversation moved to the evidence, and this is where things became genuinely difficult. Reports had surfaced, suggesting that among the physical evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home, one notable item was a single hair, without a root. O'Connell said she refused to accept that as the full picture. She was direct about it. Someone would have to prove that to her before she believed it. A scene like Nancy's home, with blood on the front doorstep and a blood trail ending at the curb, does not yield only one hair. In her professional experience, there is more there. There has to be. But she was also careful to note that even a rootless hair carries investigative value. Mitochondrial DNA analysis can be extracted from it, tracing the maternal line and providing a direction even without a full DNA profile. In a case that appeared to be struggling for forward momentum, any confirmed direction matters enormously. What she could not move past, and what clearly unsettled her at a deep professional level, was the question of what a full FBI evidence response team deployment might have recovered that was not recovered in those earliest days. She described what that search actually looks like when it is done properly. 15 to 30 trained agents moving through every inch of the property, every room, every outbuilding, every garage, taking the doormat where the blood was found, removing door handles, using a saw to cut out floor tiles if the situation calls for it, processing every surface that could hold biological material, fiber evidence, or trace evidence invisible to the eye. She referenced cases where her team had done exactly that, arriving with everything they had, and methodically dismantling a scene down to its bones to find what needed to be found. That level of response was available in Tucson. It was ready, and what actually occurred, by contrast, was an entry into the home on approximately day 5 that O'Connell described as almost certainly truncated. Hours long, rather than the exhaustive. Full complement. Search the scene demanded. The doormat was later observed still in place at the home. That detail landed heavily in the conversation. In O'Connell's judgment, that mat should have been taken into evidence from the very beginning. The front door, the door handles, the surrounding flooring, all of it warranted the kind of processing that only a fully deployed evidence response team can provide. And the window to do that comprehensively in those first critical hours does not reopen. Brian Entin then asked O'Connell about FBI Director Kash Patel's public comments regarding the case, and her analysis of why a sitting director would speak that openly about an ongoing local investigation was one of the most sobering moments in the entire conversation. She said she could arrive at only 2 conclusions. The first was that the case is in significantly worse shape than the public has been told, and that Patel's comments represented an attempt to position the Bureau ahead of an outcome that may not be what anyone is hoping for. The second was that the situation inside the investigation was even more dysfunctional than what has already become public, and that the director felt it necessary to say so on record, regardless of the diplomatic cost. She noted that, in her experience, spanning some of the most consequential federal investigations of the modern era, she had never seen a director speak that way about a local case. Not during Waco, not during the aftermath of the ATF operation the FBI was later called in to address, a situation where the Bureau inherited chaos and was publicly blamed for it anyway. Directors build bridges. They absorb friction. They do not publicly call out local partners by name or implication. The fact that Patel departed from that tradition entirely tells its own story about how seriously the Bureau views what happened and what was prevented from happening in Tucson. And running alongside all of this, a separate reckoning was taking shape inside Pima County's own political structure. The Board of Supervisors scheduled a formal meeting to take up the question of whether Sheriff Chris Nanos should be removed from office. The legal pathway to removing an elected sheriff in Arizona is narrow. The state constitution contains specific provisions tied to the timeliness of an elected official's formal responses to board inquiries. Nanos had been required to submit responses to questions about his professional background, including allegations that he had misrepresented prior disciplinary suspensions from his time at the El Paso Police Department. Those allegations, layered on top of everything that had emerged about the handling of the Guthrie investigation, had created a level of institutional scrutiny around the sheriff that was by any measure extraordinary. Whether the board would ultimately have the legal standing to act remained an open question. But the meeting itself represented something that could not be dismissed: a formal, public accounting of the idea that leadership failures in a missing persons case carry consequences that reach beyond the investigation itself. 100 days. That number sits over everything. 100 days since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona. 100 days since blood was found on her front doorstep, since her Ring camera was ripped from the wall, since a blood trail ended at the curb where a vehicle had been waiting. 100 days during which hundreds of FBI agents sat staged and ready, a command structure buckled under disorganization, and a border crossing 45 minutes away processed thousands of vehicles with no coordinated federal eyes, watching for what may have passed through. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's whereabouts, please call 1-800-CALL-FBI. Your call can be completely anonymous. A reward remains available. One call from the right person changes everything. This case is not cold. This story is not finished. And this channel is not going anywhere until there are answers. Stay with Keith's Crime Files. Subscribe if you have not already. Leave a like on this video so that more people find this story and keep coming back, because we will follow this case wherever it leads. Nancy Guthrie has not been forgotten. Not here. Not ever.